Hello friends, this is your friend Deepak and today I am going to present my assignment topic of subject AB721, that is biochemistry of biotic and abiotic stress on multifactorial disorder in obesity. So let's start with it. Multifactorial disorder are the medical problems which do not have a single genetic cause. That is, they are likely associated with the effects of multiple genes in combination with the lifestyle and environmental factors. So we can say that the condition caused by many contributing factors are called as complex or multifactorial disorder. Now I will discuss a little bit about obesity. Obesity is a complex and multifactorial disease caused by interaction of married genetics, dietary, lifestyle and environmental factors. It is characterized by the abnormal fat accumulation in the tissues and organs and induces negative effects on human health. WHO defines obesity as an excessive or abnormal body fat accumulation due to positive energy balance that may impair health. WHO gives BMI as a criteria for one to measure their obesity level. BMI is calculated as the ratio of an individual weight in kilograms to their squared height in meters. Let us understand this by an example. If a person is weighing 75 kg and having a height of 1.65 meters, then if we calculate the BMI, then the BMI comes to 27.55. Obesity is a leading preventable cause of death worldwide, with increasing rates in adults and children. Prevent because we can prevent obesity by various types of management practices. I will discuss management practices in the end time. In 2015, GBD Group conducted a survey over 195 countries and found out that 600 million adults and 100 million children were obese in 195 countries, and women are more susceptible towards obesity as compared to men. On the basis of factors, we can categorize obesity into two types, that is monogenic obesity or intrinsic obesity, or polygenic obesity or multifactorial obesity. Under monogenic obesity, there comes LEP, that is leptin, LEPR, that is leptin receptor, POMC, that is pro-opiomelanocortin, PCSK1, that is pro-protein convertase, MC4R, that is melanocortin 4 receptors. Mutation in these types leads to monogenic obesity. Leptin is liporegulating hormone produced primarily in adipose tissue. It inhibits food intake and stimulates energy expenditure. Whereas LEPR is leptin receptor, which is expressed in different types of tissues, and it exerts its function in the hypothalamus via JAK-STAT pathway to promote transcription of gene encoding anaerogenic proteins. POMC, that is pro-opiomelanocortin, it inhibits food intake. PCSK1, that is pro-protein convertase, is essential for activating cleavage of many peptides hormones that are implicated in the regulation of food ingestion, glucose homeostasis and energy homeostasis, such as pro-opiomelanocortin, pro-insulin, pro-glucagon and progerin. MC4R, that is melanocortin 4 receptor, is responsible for the energy homeostasis, food intake, anti-inflammatory, drug tolerance and sexual behavior. Under multifactorial obesity, physical factors, chemical factors and biological factors play a major role leads to obesity. Under physical factors, diet and exercise are the major players. In chemical factors, endocrine disruptors play a major role. Under biological factors, various types of microbiota and viruses and parasites play a role. Now moving on to classification of obesity, WHO classify obesity into underweight, normal range, overweight and obesity classes 1, 2 and 3. If a person is having BMI, that is body mass index, greater than 30, then it comes into obesity category 1, 2 or 3, and the risk of diseases occur in that person varies from high to extremely high depending on the type of obesity, that is class 1, class 2 or class 3. These are other factors rather than which I have already discussed, that is age, gender, environmental factors, psychological factors, genetic factors, hereditary, endocrinological causes, food intake, dietary factors, sedentary lifestyle, medical and psychiatric illness. These factors also play a major role in leading to obesity. Now I will start with multifactorial disorder in obesity. I have enlisted most common types of disorder that are occur in obesity, that is hypertension, diabetes mellitus, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular alterations, lung diseases, cancer, neurological disorders, reproductive disorders and hormonal diseases. Now starting with hypertension. Hypertension is a disorder in which blood pressure in the arteries is persistently elevated, which leads to hypertension. The 90 to 95% of cases of hypertension are primary, and these are due to the non-specific lifestyle and the genetic factors. Hypertension is caused by the complex interaction of genes and environmental factors. Hypertension affects our kidney, endocrine and metabolic functions. GWAS, that is Genome-Wide Association Study, have identified 35 genetic loci related to blood pressure. 12 of these genetic loci influencing the blood pressure were newly found. Sentinel SNP for each new genetic locus identified has shown an association with the DNA methylation at multiple nearby CpG sites. Here, Sentinel SNP is the SNP which gave the best signal in a multi-SNP analysis. It is measured by the p-value association. The other causes of hypertension are obesity, sleep apnea, pregnancy, excessive drinking of alcohol, etc. Now, this figure shows the pathway that leads to hypertension. Here, leptin and POMC, that is propiomelaanocortin, renin, RAS, that is renin angiotensin aldosterone system, and renal compression leads to increase in sodium absorption. That leads to increase in atrial hypertension and ultimately hypertension. Now moving on to diabetes mellitus. Diabetes mellitus is a metabolic disorder that is characterized by high blood sugar level over a prolonged period of time. That leads to diabetes. In obese individuals, adipose tissue releases a high amount of non-esterified fatty acids, glycerol, pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-6, TNF-alpha and hormones. This leads to the development of insulin resistance, which generates compensatory hyperinsulinemia with overstimulation of pancreatic cells and reduction of insulin receptors. Now this figure shows the pathway that leads to insulin receptor resistance. In this figure, here adipocyte increase takes place due to obesity, and which leads to increase in the release of IL-6, TNF-alpha, increase in the level of free fatty acids and resistin, due to which the upcoming signaling pathway gets affected. Here intracellular fat and the mitochondrial ROS that is reactive oxygen species, acts on pKc, which leads to the phosphorylation of serine amino acids, which ultimately leads to inhibition of PI3K pathway that leads to the insulin receptor resistance. Now moving on to dyslipidemia, an abnormal amount of lipid in the blood causes dyslipidemia. It is due to the abnormal amount of triglycerides, cholesterol or fat phospholipids. The prolonged elevation of insulin levels can also lead to dyslipidemia. Increased level of O-linked N-acetyl glucosamine transferase may also causes dyslipidemia. The various causes of dyslipidemia can be genetic or secondary to another conditions. This figure shows the qualitative changes in the lipoproteins. Here ApoB, ApoE, ApoC3, ApoA1 are the apolipoprotein. Here VLDL is very low density lipoprotein, IDL is intermediate lipoprotein, LDL is low density lipoprotein, HDL is high density lipoprotein. This shows the interconversion of these lipoproteins leads to dyslipidemia due to their abnormal amounts. Here CE is cholesterol esters and CETP is cholesterol ester transfer proteins that converts it to TG, that is triglycerides, and it can be converted back to CE, that is cholesterol ester as well. Now moving on to cardiovascular alterations. Cardiovascular alterations includes high level of total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, high blood pressure, fibrinogen and insulin in the obese person. Low level of HDL cholesterol, low level of plasminogen activator inhibitor 1 causes impaired fibrinolytic activity in the obese person with the abdominal obesity. These above mentioned factors increases the risk of heart failure, sudden cardiac death, chest pain and the abnormal heart rhythm. Increase in the electrical alteration in the obesity lead to the frequent ventricular dysrhythmias even in the absence of heart dysfunction. A study shows that annual sudden cardiac death rate was approximately 40 times higher in the obese people than in the normal population. Now this figure shows us the various types of abnormalities that occurs in the obese person. It also shows the increased risk of cardiovascular disease in the obese person which is having the visceral adipose tissue due to the increase in free fatty acid release, increase in inflammatory cytokines, increase in peripheral resistance, decrease in cardiac output, decrease in endothelium dependent vasodilation. Figure also shows us the various types of adipose tissue or fat accumulation locations like perivascular tissue, myocardial fat, pancreas fat, renal sinus fat, muscle fat, epi or pericardial adipose tissue, liver fat, subcutaneous fat, visceral adipose tissue and subcutaneous or gluteal femoral adipose tissue. These are various sites that leads to different types of cardiovascular alterations in an obese person. Now starting with lung diseases, obesity is associated with the increased risk of chronic respiratory disorders like asthma, hypoventilation syndrome and sleep apnea. Lungs may become more susceptible for injury with the increase in ozone, gastric acid and bacterial and non-bacterial particles on second hit that I will explain in the figure. Injury depends on overall balance between the offense and defense, that is the pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory adipocytokines. Now this figure shows us the overall mechanism of obesity, inflammation and lung injury. As we can see in the fit individuals, the adipocytes are smaller in size. That maintains a balance between the pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory adipocytokines and M1 and M2M macrophages, Th2 that is T helper cell 2 drag, Th1 and Th17. But when obesity occurs, these fat cells, that is adipocytes, gets enlarged, which leads to the more amount of release in the adipocytokines, and due to which this balance between the pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory adipocytokines gets disturbed, which leads to the activation of TLR4 receptors, NF-kappa B, etc., and suppresses our immunity, due to which our lungs becomes more susceptible to the damage. And when our lungs are susceptible to damage, and the second hit that I was talking about of ozone transplantation or bacterial or non-bacterial particles occurs, then it leads to our lung injury. Now, starting with cancer, there are multiple factors which potentially contribute to the progression of cancer in obesity and type 2 diabetes. The factors like hyperinsulinemia and insulin-like growth factor, that is IGF-1, hyperglycemia, dyslipidemia, adipokines and cytokines, and the gut microbiome are responsible for the tumor progression. Metabolic changes may contribute directly or indirectly to the cancer progression. Intentional weight loss may protect against cancer development, and therapies for diabetes may prove to be effective adjuvant agents in the reducing cancer. Now this figure shows us various pathways of hyperinsulinemia, sex hormone binding globulin, insulin-like growth factor, dyslipidemia, increase in bioavailable estrogen, and leptin-dependent pathway, which ultimately leads to increase in the cell growth, which leads to cancer. Now starting with neurological disorders, attention deficit, poor executive function, impaired decision making, and decreased verbal learning and memory loss are common disorder in the obesity. To mild cognitive impairment, men are more susceptible than women. That is, men are more prone to the mild cognitive impairment if a person or man is having obesity. High fat diet leads to the reduction in the markers of neurogenesis, synaptic plasticity, and neuronal growth. Prolonged obesity may lead to dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and the Parkinson's disease. Person with the bipolar disorder may also develop obesity due to its non-controllable feeding behavior. Now this figure explains us the increase in the adipose tissue due to the caloric excess, due to which the increased lipolysis takes place, which leads to increase in the free fatty acids, which acts on the liver, muscle, and the pancreas, and ectopic fat deposition takes place in muscle and the pancreas, which leads to the insulin resistance and the tissue dysfunction, and it increases the risk of metabolic syndromes. Also, increase in the free fatty acid circulation leads to the peripheral nervous system in the risk of increased risk of polyneuropathy. Also, in autonomic nerves, it increases the risk of sympathetic tone. In CNS, it increases the risk of mild cognitive impairment and the Alzheimer's disease. Now moving on to reproductive disorder. In male, the reproductive disorders are associated with the suppression of testosterone, free testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin. Azoospermia, that is no sperm, and oligozoospermia, that is few sperms, are also associated with the obesity. Testicular tumor and more aggressive prostate cancers may occur in person with higher level of obesity. In females, the lower ovarian function, endometrial, ovarian, uterine, cervical and breast cancer malignancies occurs due to obesity. Recent studies have suggested that 50% and 70% increases in the risk of premenopausal breast cancer among the overweight and the obese women occurs due to the obesity. Genome-wide association study analysis of DNA methylation via immunoprecipitation found 40 genes in the blood cells of polycystic ovary syndrome women that are differentially methylated as compared to the healthy women. Now this figure shows us the dependence of the sex organs on different types of signaling by hypothalamus GnRH release and Leydig hormone and follicular stimulating hormone release from the pituitary gland, and these signalings are affected by the pancreas, insulin, leptin, adiponectin, inflammation, oxidative stress and other cytokines, also the gut microbiota and the ghrelin, which ultimately affects our ovary in females and testes in the males, which leads to depletion in the levels of testosterone and the estrogen in the males and females respectively. Now these are the various types of hormonal changes that are seen in the obesity. The person with obesity has found to have decrease in the level of SHBG, that is sex hormone binding globulin, testosterone, growth hormone, vitamin D, calcium, ghrelin, which leads to the various metabolic conditions including lower calcium metabolism leading to bone related issues, stunted height and than normal, lower sexual activity, lower levels of melanin pigment, etc. Obesity also leads to the high or increase in the level of serum cortisol, urine cortisol, TSH, that is thyroid stimulating hormone, parathyroid hormone, leptin, plasma aldosterone, plasma renin, which also affects our various types of metabolic functions and affects our normal homeostasis. Now starting with gut microbiota relation with the obesity. A healthy person have 90% of its gut microbiota from the two phyla, that is Firmicutes and the Bacteroidetes, which are present in a specific ratio. An increase in the Firmicutes to the Bacteroidetes ratio and an increased capacity for energy extraction from the dietary intake leads to obesity. The obese person having the abundance of genes involved in the hydrogen and the methane production. Decrease in the genes associated with the hydrogen sulfide production is also associated with the obese microbiota. The obesity-related differences have also been identified at the species level, including Clostridium inoculum, Eubacterium ptolicum, and Catinibacterium methuswocki, Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus sakei. Now, this figure shows us the gut microbial metabolism of dietary PUFA, that is polyunsaturated fatty acids, that confers to host resistance to the obesity in normal healthy individuals. But when the firmicutes to the bacteroidetes ratio gets disturbed, then this metabolization gets disturbed, which leads to the obesity. Now these are the different medical conditions which occurs due to obesity under cardiology, endocrinology and reproductive medicine, neurology, psychiatry and rheumatology and orthopedics. You can see that coronary heart disease, congenital heart failure, high BP, abnormal cholesterol level, thrombosis, etc. occurs in cardiology. Diabetes, polycystic ovarian syndrome, menstrual disorder, infertility, complication during pregnancy, birth defect and intrauterine fetal death occurs in the endocrinology and reproductive medicine. In neurology, strokes, migraines, carpal tunnel syndrome, that is a condition that causes numbness, tingling or weakness in your hand. Dementia, idiopathic intracranial hypertension, multiple sclerosis. In psychiatry, depression in women and social stigmatization are very common. In rheumatology and orthopedics, gout, poor mobility, osteoarthritis and low back pain are very most common diseases occurs. Osteoarthritis is the most common disease that occurs in the obesity. Now moving on to management practices of obesity, we can control obesity by doing these types of practices like exercise, pharmacotherapy, that is using pharmaceutical drugs or medicine in controlling obesity, bariatric surgery, that is the various types of procedures which causes the weight loss by restricting the amount of food by the stomach can hold, causing the malabsorption of nutrients, or by a combination of both gastric restrictions and the malabsorptions. Dietary approach. Under dietary approach, which can include various types of healthy food, low calorie diet intake according to the nutritional requirement of the body, which ultimately leads to the decrease in the level of obesity of a person. Now moving on to conclusion, I would like to conclude that we can prevent all types of multifactorial disorder and obesity by taking healthy diet with the required energy by the body. If we control our diet, then we ultimately control all types of diseases. Homeostasis is the major key player in maintaining a healthy body. So we should maintain a balance between diet, regular exercising, etc. The most of the diseases are preventable, and by taking suitable precautions and management, we can prevent most of the diseases like obesity and the various types of multifactorial disorders. In extreme cases, the medication and the therapy are only solution, so we should not hesitate in taking these solutions. And for the future perspective, we can study various drug targeted sites in controlling obesity or various types of diseases associated with the obesity. We can also study the various types of evolutionary relationships among different species and the disease associated with it in different species. And these are my references. Thank you so much guys for your patience and attention.